Hello, everybody. Thanks for this opportunity to share my thoughts on chapters 42 to 54. Can you forgive her? Who is her? Alice, of course. Back in chapter 37, the narrator argues Alice's case explicitly. He tells us she has, quote, sinned against her sex by rejecting Mr. Gray, for whom she feels a warm sexual love, and mad with vile ambition, she agrees to marry George Vavasor, for whom she feels a physical repulsion. But as I reread this novel, I wondered if her also refers to Glencora and Arabella Greenough, and maybe even Sister Kate, and perhaps every woman. The novel, and these chapters perhaps more than most, is filled with men feeling disappointed, impatient, angry, and even enraged with the women they supposedly love. Mr. Palliser returns home after midnight following his successful speech in the Queen's Speech debate. He is hoping to usurp the present Chancellor of the Exchequer. That still happens today. And that goal is the only thing on his mind right now. But Glencora has just arrived in the city with a love letter in her pocket from another man. In it, her former lover, Burgo Fitzgerald, quote, begged her to let him have some means of knowing whether her heart was true to him, end of quote. It is hardly too much to say that Lady Glencora looked to Alice to save her. Mr. Palliser greets her with a brotherly embrace and gives her a detailed recap of his speech. When she cannot suppress a yawn, he peevishly accuses her of not caring. He cannot join her in bed because he has stuff to do. But in lieu of love, he announces that Mr. Bott is coming to dinner and suggests she invite his mother's intrusive friend, Mrs. Marsham, as a female companion. When Glencora wishes to invite Alice instead, peevish Mr. Palliser retorts, quote, I am sorry that you have refused the first favor I have asked you this year, end of quote. Completely unfair and obviously untrue. I have always enjoyed the illustrations that are often embedded in Victorian novels. But when I read Vanity Fair with Thackeray's own illustrations, I began to understand that the best illustrations expand on the text rather than simply visually repeating it. For the first edition of Can You Forgive Her, Volume 1 was illustrated by Hablot Knight Brown, better known as Fizz, and a favorite of Dickens. Trollope was not pleased with Brown's work, and the illustrations for Volume 2 were drawn by a Miss E. Taylor. Here is her drawing of Glencora making her exit. Let's hope this works here. Friendships will not come by ordering. Alone in her bedroom, after writing her invitation to Alice, Glencora muses on the cruelty of husbands, quote. She had been told over and over again in the days before her marriage that Burgo would ill-use her if he became her husband. The Marquis of Old Reekie had gone so far as to suggest that Burgo might probably beat her. Would it not even be better to be beaten by him than to have politics explained to her at 1 o'clock at night by such a husband as Plantagenet Palliser? The British Constitution indeed, end of quote. The next afternoon, just as Glencora is about to share Burgo's letter with Alice, Mrs. Marsham is announced. Now, Mrs. Marsham, a woman who, quote, thought evil rather than good, has made keeping Glencora under control her pet project. She was no fool and knew well what was going on in the world. She could talk about the latest novel, or if need be, about the Constitution, end of quote. She quickly recognizes Alice is an advocate for Glencora and decides that part of her project will be to put Alice down. At dinner, Mrs. Marsham, Mr. Palliser, and Mr. Bott manage to snub Alice despite Glencora's best attempts. Alice vows to avoid this house as much as possible, a resolution in close accordance with Mrs. Marsham's own views. This illustration for chapter 44 is by Linton Lamb, a 20th century English artist, designer, author, lithographer, and illustrator. It's a photo I took of the illustration in my Oxford University Press edition. If you look closely, you can see the army of men carrying the placards, VAVASOR. The election for the Member of Parliament for the Chelsea district goes ahead, and George Vavasor wins with the help of an apocryphal story about river embankments and £3,000 or £4,000 of what he believes to be Alice's money. About £350,000 in today's money, or $400,000. Quote, dishonesty, ignorance, and vulgarity do not close the gate of that heaven against aspirants, unquote, as illustrated by the grand entrance of George Vavasor and Mr. Bott to the floor of the House of Commons. Mr. Bott was born small, the narrator tells us, but George Vavasor had educated himself to badness with his eyes open. By the end of that first tedious evening in Parliament, George is gloomy and disillusioned and seriously doubting himself. He decides to go see Alice and get her to boost his ego with her admiration. In our last session, Sati compared George with Burgo Fitzgerald. To me, one of the most striking contrasts between these two friends is their appearance. While Burgo's beauty is undiminished in spite of his decadent lifestyle, George's face was terribly scarred as a youth by a burglar's chisel, leaving a, quote, black ravine running through his cheek, end of quote, from his eye to his chin. I think the illustration Miss E. Taylor did for the chapter, A Gift of Love, comes nowhere near the horror of George's angry face, providing an example of an illustration that I think fails to capture the scene, and the reader loses because of it. Quote, when last I was here, I asked you for a kiss. As he said this, he looked at her with all his eyes, with his mouth just open so as to show the edges of his white teeth, with the wound down his face all wide and purple. The last word came with a stigmatizing hiss from his lips, end of quote. Why is he so angry? Because even though he doesn't care two straws about Alice's feelings, he thinks she owes him warmth, admiration, and affection. He cannot forgive her. He throws his love gift into the fireplace, and a diamond from that ring is lost forever. The ring that he bought with money he thought was Alice's own. Her love for him, like the diamond, is lost forever. The very next chapter focuses on a parallel scene. Mr. Cheesacre's disappointment. Now, Mr. Cheesacre has been enthusiastically courting Arabella Vavasor Greenough for months, and the prime attraction for him, like George's for Alice, has been Mrs. Greenough's money. That she is physically attractive is an added bonus. Her firm refusal brings him to tears. Is this because he really does love her, as the narrator asserts? Or is his pride hurt like George's? Can he ever forgive her for rejecting him? I like this illustration by Miss E. Taylor better. We see Captain Belfield walking in and catching Mr. Cheesacre on his knees. Should I wish you joy? The next chapter shifts the scene. In the next chapter, the scene shifts abruptly back to London, to Lady Monk's townhouse in Gloucester Square. I think that's Gloucester. I did try to work on that. Enter the beautiful Burgo Fitzgerald. Who is also trying to persuade a woman to be his, body and money. Again, we have the question, does he really love Glencora? His aunt, Lady Monk, is planning a party, at least partly, in order to give Burgo access to Glencora. For me, this illustration by Linton Lamb really captures Burgo's beauty and attitude, providing an effective addition to the text. And you can see Lady Monk there too. Burgo, look here, says Lady Monk. Although a minor character, Lady Monk gets 3 eponymous chapters and is interesting in her own right. Such love as she had to give, she gave to Burgo. Although she snubs any woman who has left her husband, even if he ill-used her dreadfully, she considers Burgo's efforts to run away with Glencora a different matter. She compares aiding and abetting this project to, quote, helping a nun out of her convent, unquote. She gives Burgo 200 pounds. Glencora appeals to Mr. Palliser to excuse her from the dangerous obligation of Lady Monk's party, but he insists that she go. He energetically expresses his disapproval of her in a long lecture, quote, in which he said a good deal of his own justice and forbearance, and something also of her frivolity and childishness, unquote. She begs Alice to come with her, but Alice has had more than enough of high society and refuses. She delays her arrival at the party, but Burgo still awaits her. Quote, how beautiful he was as he gazed up at her. And Burgo, if it was so that he had not heart enough to love truly, could look as though he loved. End of quote. Avoiding Mr. Bott, that baboon with the bristly beard, she finds Mr. Palliser just as he is leaving. Stuff to do, you know. It's as though he believes that if he ignores what is going on right in front of him, everything will be okay. Burgo boldly approaches Glencora, who is being scolded again by Mrs. Marsham. Will you waltz? With his letter in her pocket, quote, Lady Glencora went off towards the dancers, leaning on Burgo's arm, end of quote. Here's another illustration by Linton Lamb. Whirling around the room together. Everyone is watching disapprovingly, especially Mrs. Marsham and Mr. Bott. Overwhelmed by the audacity of such a display, they agree that someone should fetch Mr. Palliser. They agree the messenger should be Mrs. Marsham, and away she goes. Mr. Palliser appears in the nick of time. Glencora was on the edge of yielding to Burgo's persuasions, or was she? Can Mr. Palliser forgive her? Is there anything to forgive? Will Burgo follow up on that last whispered, I will? If she breaks her word, will Burgo forgive her? The story returns to George Vavasor, who never forgives anybody, certainly not Alice. Quote, he was a man to whom any personal slight from a woman was unendurable, end of quote. But he still needs her money, unless Of course, he would never really murder his grandfather, but he knew he could do it with impunity if he chose to. Both the murderers whose stories he refers to were hanged, but he would learn from their mistakes. He thinks of strangling rather than openly shooting or secretly poisoning. Here is a cartoon of Rush shooting Isaac Jeremy. George has a better plan. While entertaining these bold speculations on murder, George drops in at Mr. Scrubby's office in Great Marlborough Street. Mr. Scrubby injudiciously mentioned the name of Mr. Tome, and the fat is in the fire. George learns that his money came directly from John Gray, and furious sets out to confront him. He meets John Gray in the street, and they return to John's lodgings together. Quote, George looked full into Gray's face, and Gray looked full into his. And as he looked, the great cicatrice seemed to open itself and to become purple with fresh blood stains, unquote. Considering the violence detailed in this scene, it surprised me that there seems to be no illustration. I borrowed this one from an edition of George Eliot's Felix Holt. The artist is unknown. In the fisticuffs that ensues, George strikes all the blows, but Gray manages to push him out the door and down the stairs. George jumps up ready to renew his attack, but is grabbed by the collar by John Gray's landlord, a tailor. Now, quote, of all tradesmen in London, the tailors are, no doubt, the most combative, end of quote. Who knew that? So George leaves the field, musing on how badly everything is going for him. He resolves to get the money he needs, no matter what violence he must use, no matter who must be destroyed, Alice, Kate, or his grandfather. John Gray is miserable and does blame Alice. At this point, he cannot forgive her. George had almost taught himself to believe that it would be a good deed to squeeze what remained of life out of that violent old throat. But indeed, the embers of life were burning low, and had George known all the truth, he would hardly have inclined his mind to thoughts of murder. That's a quote. The old squire is failing, with only Kate to care for him. Although we are not inclined to forgive Kate for her betrayal of Alice, she is quite adept and compassionate when dealing with the squire's deathbed demands. Quote, she was very good to the old man, tending all his wants, taking his violence with good humor rather than with submission, unquote. At 8 o'clock on the evening of the day, Kate sends letters to George and Aunt Greenough asking for their help. The old man was dead, having exerted his will and had his way to the end. I like this illustration by Miss E. Taylor, showing Kate with her dying grandfather. Much later that night, all alone in the old house with her grandfather lying dead upstairs, Kate finally reads a letter from Alice that arrived earlier in the day. She learns that her brother came to Alice in a rage and accused her of conspiring with Mr. Gray to humiliate George. When Alice denied this, he, quote, disbelieved her, looking at her in that way which he has when he is enraged, unquote. He threw a letter knife about and insisted that she write a letter to their own lawyer authorizing a payment of £5,000. When she collapsed with weeping, he grabbed her by the arms and threatened her with punishment if she didn't comply. Alice is vague about the details, for she is traumatized by the violent assault, but Kate sees it all. She is deeply remorseful for her own intrigues to bring about a union between Alice and her brother. a union she hoped would save George from self-destruction. Will she ever forgive herself? Kate communicates the news of the old squire's death to the other survivors, and they all reach Vavasor Hall in Westmoreland at about the same time. His daughter, Mrs. Greenow, his son, John Vavasor, and his grandson and supposed heir, George Vavasor. When John Vavasor and his nephew accidentally meet in the refreshment room near the end of their journey, John makes an effort to be civil to his nephew. "So, my father is gone, George," said the uncle. "Yes," said George, "he's gone at last. I wonder what we shall find to have been his last act of injustice." John Vavasor turned away disgusted. End of quote. This illustration by Linton Lamb shows George in all his selfish arrogance, his smirk, and his scar. There is a bit of a cliffhanger here. We will have to wait 2 weeks for the reveal of the contents of the will. Thank you.